Hey there, this is First Line to Last Mile with Kim. It's episode 3. We're still working on a math app for kids. In the first episode, we built out the app from scratch using a couple of high-level prompts. In the second episode, we iterated on that by adding some additional features. And we noted that the complexity of the state management was growing our pain. In this episode, we're going to refactor the page where the kids are working on math problems to try and address some of that. And then we're going to add some unit tests as well. On the landing page, the children can pick their profile or add a new profile. For the math problems, we added some conditional logic based on grade level and whether they were answering the questions correctly or not. So for kindergarten, they always see a visual hint and they only get presented with addition problems. And they have multiple choice to select the right answer with. For first and second grade, it's still multiple choice, but now they only see the visual hint if they get the initial answer wrong. Like here. They also get to work on subtraction, if I didn't mention that already. For second through fifth grade, they don't get hints and they have to type the correct answer instead. It looks like there's an issue with the day and night mode where the font automatically changes color. So let me just fix that manually first before we do anything else. And so I'm gonna do text. Let's do gray 800 is fine. And so now we should actually be able to see the input, and we do. So that's all good. Okay, so what I want to do is address again the complexity of the level page, which it's a pretty typical remix page. There's a loader function that grabs data from the database. Here we're grabbing the level and the user information and the progress that this user currently has, and then we're returning that to the React component. We also have an action function for handling when the child submits their answer, which is also pretty typical remix. And then finally we have a React component that constitutes the whole page, so everything you see here. And as you can also see, there's a lot of state management up at the top, and then there's a lot of conditional logic and some use effects for updating and manipulating that state. And it's already at a point where it's getting challenging both for Copilot but certainly also for human developers to fully understand how all of this is connected and what it relates to on the page. Instead of splitting out into other React components, Copilot ended up defining a bunch of helper routines for rendering parts of the page, which then is all strung together here at the bottom where the rest of the page is defined. And it's quite a lot. It's almost 700 lines, right? So let's begin to break that down so we have a better chance of understanding what's going on. And I think certainly that the header should be easy gimme. And then the visual hints, I think that's a good candidate for a simple refactoring, hopefully. And then the difference between whether when we show text input or whether we do multiple choice input, I think that's another good candidate for refactoring. And hopefully when we do that, we'll begin to chip away at some of the complexity in we have, especially at the top of this page here. I think the first point here may be a little too long-winded to fully demonstrate in practice, but it touches on a theme that we also came across of both the two previous episodes, which is that if you have any expectations or any opinions about the desired outcome of a prompt, then it's better to be more explicit about that and state it up front, because if you don't, then Copilot and Claude, they're just going to come up with details on their own to fill in the blanks. It doesn't ask you to validate or verify unless you specifically craft the prompt to do that. So the risk is that if you don't provide those colors, then you're going to get something back that may or may not fit what you're looking for. And in a similar vein, I think especially for refactoring, it's good to approach this with fairly scoped steps or increments, because I can ask it to refactor the whole app and it will merely attempt to do that. But then again, if it makes decisions or if it begins to do things in a way that you don't actually agree with, then you now have to either roll everything back, or you have to spend additional effort to undo and refactor further the things that you want to pull in a different direction. So I think, especially when you're approaching new areas, it's better to carve out a particular scope. And then once you're satisfied with how that was done, if that pattern is repeated elsewhere, then you can point to that and say, refactor this other example or case, just like we did the first one, and you have a better chance of getting an outcome that is aligned with what you're looking for. First up, let's move that header out. Can you move the level header to a separate file under a components directory? Okay, that was pretty quick. It created the component subdirectory and created a level header component, and then it deleted that same render logic from the level page and replaced that with JSX for placing the level header component there instead. And that's it. So that's pretty good. Let's keep that. Next, I would like to address the visual hint, which we have for kindergarten and conditionally for first and second grade. So that, I think, would be another easy thing to refactor. Can you move the visual hints to the components directory? Okay, it finished. And let's take a look. It created a component called visual hints. Interestingly, it defined the user grade prop, which isn't being used. And then it also broke into a component that is for the addition and a component that is for subtraction. So I think under the hood, visual hints, conditionally renders one or the other. And then let's confirm that it removed all of that from the level page, which it did. And finally, let's double check that it still works. And that still looks fine. So that's good. Yeah, I'm curious what it was trying to, what it thought it needed the user grade for, but because it's not being used, let's remove it. We can always add it later, and then we don't have to wonder what that is being used for on this side. So that is all good. So now let's take a closer look at the multiple choice versus text input. And it started out with only having multiple choice, and then we asked it in episode 2 to add the ability to support keyboard input. And in line with rule of 3, I noticed that it did end up with separate state for the two, and it's somewhat confusing or complex logic for keeping track of when it's one or the other and when to display what based on whether we're doing keyboard input or not, like here. For prototyping and for building out the initial implementation, it's better, I think, to focus on figuring out what should this thing look like, how should overall behavior work, and then we can always come back and clean up some of the technical debt that we're building up. And so that's exactly what we're looking at right now. And then the question is, we should be able to get by with just one state is my hunch, but we may be able to get there piecemeal in a slightly safer way where we incrementally do some of the updates instead of asking Copilot to do a very complex update of this. What I want to try now is to see if we can just extract the multiple choice out and see what that does. Can you move the multiple choice buttons? and state. No, actually just multiple choice buttons, 2 components. Okay, it finished up. Let's see, it added a component called multiple choice. And it doesn't really do any local state management. We'll see if we can do something about that later. Pretty much just lifted over the code for rendering the layout of the JSX for that component. So when we go over here to the level page, we see that's exactly what it did. But that's fine. It's one step at a time. So we have selected answer, correct answer, showing second chance or not, can make selection. What is can make selection? That is whether, that is whether that component is, whether the button's enabled or not. Okay. So that's fine. And then let's move the keyboard input as well. Okay, it's done. So it did the same here. Simply just lifted and shifted the JSX part for handling and rendering the keyboard related stuff over into a new component called keyboard input that lives under components, but it left all of the state management in the level page. But now that we've moved a lot of the code out that depends on this state, I think we have a better chance of doing the next set of refactors, which are focused instead on the state that we have here. And so I think the first one is definitely that there's logic here for handling key press. There's logic for handling keyboard input, and then there's logic for handling selection from the multiple choice buttons. And there's definitely overlap in all of that. I find this clunky now that that lives here. I think that would be great if we can push that inside the keyboard input component. There's also something here that I really don't like, which is that we have a form down here that is for submitting the answer to the server side. And then, so for the case where the child hits enter in the text input, the way this is implemented is it uses low-level DOM lookup to find that form and then submit. But I think it's messier in 2 levels actually, because it's not really the remix way of doing this. More fundamentally, it's brittle when you have these kind of dependencies where it's not clear other than here that there is this dependency between the form and this keyboard handler, right? And so that can easily break because you don't realize that there are 2 different ways that this form down here can actually be submitted. And Remix actually has a built-in high-level feature for programmatic doing these things where you can have both. You can have the form and let it operate as a normal form. And then there's the React way, where if you want to pass stuff around, you can pass refs. So let's see if we can get that part in line with the Remix way of doing things. But again, I want to do this piecemeal. So the first thing is, now that the input lives in keyboard input, let's make this a high-level method, and then we can decide what we want to do with it once we have that. So I'm going to add a new method. And this one, because I know exactly what I want, I'm just going to do it myself instead, because it's pretty small. Handle, submit, answer. And that one takes a answer that is a number. And then we're going to do something with that. And then we're gonna take this and move that over here. Okay, so now we have a little key down and value. Well, that is no longer a function, that is a boolean as well. And then we're gonna have the on submit answer, which is yes, just like that. So now we're just calling this callback that we defined instead, so we don't have to mess around with this part in here. And then we have handle key down. So piecemeal, we're improving things because we are now able to submit answer and submit answer. We now moved at least that part out of the high level file here, and then we have to figure out how to do the form submission, but we'll get to that in a minute. This one here gets the answer for the keyboard input. So it sets a keyboard answer. What does set keyboard answer do? That's used here. And what uses keyboard answer? This part here uses keyboard answer. We only need the value from the text input here when we actually are submitting, so not while we are actually typing. Because initially that would be null, and then when the user types the first character, it'll be a string, but that's not necessarily the final answer if the number either has a minus sign in front of it or it has multiple digits, right? But that intermediate state we only need in the keyboard component. We don't need it up here at the level page. So the only thing we need it for there is, let me demonstrate. The only thing we need to know is when we start typing, then two things appear, which is submit answer and press enter or click submit to check your answer. So we can do this internally in this as well and just call select answer instead. Here's or select, yeah, set selected answer instead. So let's try that. Let's see if we can get that to work. Unchanged is fine. I just want it to be a number or null. Number or null instead. And then we're gonna do this. Yes. This. Okay. So this could probably be flipped. In fact, let's flip it. If this is true, then we parse it, otherwise it's null. So what we're now saying is that if value happens to be either a positive or negative number, then we parse it, otherwise we return null. And then we can remove all of that. And then we just need our local state instead that gives us the value internally. So we have value. That is our internal string state. So we're getting somewhere. And we'll change. Value is value. Okay. And let's see what we need to refactor here in order to make that work. So onChain is now set selected answer. So now we're just slowly removing the code that is related to managing keyboard state here. Good, nothing is referencing keyboard answer anymore. So let's see. Are we there yet? We still have one to do, which is the handle submit on enter. But I think otherwise, does it work? Looks like it does. So let's give a wrong answer. 95. Quite. And then we need to reset this when we go to the next answer. But I think we can do that now simply by just using a key. Because keyboard input is now managing its own state internally. So we should be able to just key off the problem ID. So let's see what happens now. Okay, so let's just restart that level. So we're being asked, okay, we can enter input. Okay, so let's do it wrong again. Answer is 97, and now we give a right answer. Hooray! So it looks like that's all working like we intended. Let's make sure that multiple choice is still working as well. So back to our kindergarten. And what is 3 plus 5? That is 8. And what is 2 plus 1? Let's see, that is 2. No, not quite. Next problem. Okay, so we managed to now simplify a little bit of the state management here, where it used to, again, it used to have the duplicate state management between multiple choice and text input. But once we moved some of the more low-level state management inside keyboard input, we were now able to refactor at this level to just use selected answer, in which case I think now let's just make sure there's nothing that is called an answer that already exists. If I do this, it will yell at me if there's already a local variable called answer. There's not, so let's refactor that. Rename that as well. Set answer. Great. This one we can definitely refactor. Actually, let's just delete it. We'll get red squiggle lines where it's being called, because that is now just answer. So we right now have a form that is submitting the answer for both keyboard input and for multiple choice. So now we need to support this other case where programmatically on hitting the enter key, we make the form submit as well. We're gonna use submit instead for the programmatic case. And then it's just a matter of, do we have to duplicate building the form data? Actually, let's just do that, because that's we already have that duplication. So submit equals submit. And Now it's just a matter of calling submit instead with that form data. And let's just reload to make sure that it still works. 297, hit enter, great job. It recorded it, and let's do a wrong answer. That's 289. It also handled that, and then let's test using enter. That also works. So we definitely managed to simplify some of the mess of how state and actions were being invoked from a keyboard input. Now let's move on to the other part of this episode, which is adding unit tests. And again, you can be super high level and just say add unit tests, in which case we're rolling the dice and we're hoping we get something useful back. But I think let's be a little bit more specific. And since Remix by default uses Vt as the development server, and also by default, for your production build, it runs Vt as well in production, let's try out using Vitest instead as the test framework. I usually like to make sure that I have good coverage on the backend, so server-side logic for sure. And then sometimes the back of the front end, which is where you have typically your front-end state management and business logic. I think depending on how locked your UI is, it becomes very diminishing returns on investing in creating unit tests for whether you're rendering the expected UI or not. So it can certainly be valuable, but when you're in a phase where you know that there's going to be a lot of changes, then adding unit tests, even if they're generated by Copilot, still feels like you're adding a lot of resistance to moving quickly there. So until you get to the point where you have something in production, then I think unit test at the front end either comes very late, maybe it's actually much better served by having eventually other means for doing end-to-end testing that will capture some of that instead. We're going to put together some tests here that hopefully will exercise some of the backend logic, so the loaders and update functions that we have, and then we'll see where we can take it from there. Okay, Copilot finished up these changes. As is often the case with some of these bigger changes, it ended up trying a couple of different approaches for some of the files, realizing that there was something amiss, and then it backtracked. But eventually it pulled through, so we now have unit tests of the loader and action functions, and at a glance it looks reasonable. Again, this is definitely something you would want to spend a lot of time poring over to make sure you really understand that these tests are actually testing and that the edge cases that they test are reasonable. That's going to take some effort. But the good news is that when you identify gaps or inconsistencies in the tests, then you should be able to either fix it relatively quickly yourself or be in a position to craft prompts that very specifically direct Copilot to fill in or to add the missing cases. And so that sets up a good foundation for us. We can then move faster on refactoring things and moving things around on the level page, because we have regression testing of the stuff that we have found that we want to keep. With that, we've definitely covered enough ground here for this episode. In the next episode, I want to get started on CI/CD and maybe also some of the AWS stuff so we can get an initial deployment up. I should also mention I put all of this up in a GitHub repository. You are welcome to clone that, poke around in the source code, fork it if you want, make it your own, make your own changes. I think it'll probably be helpful to have that as a resource where you can look in detail at the changes, because sometimes when I zoom up and down the source files here, it can be a little challenging to follow along what's actually going on. And so with that, thank you so much for watching, and I hope to see you again.